Alright, welcome to Meta Ethics. I'm here with my good friend Adrian, and today we're going to be reviewing and discussing the Autobiography of Malcolm X, which I recently finished reading.
So I figured I've read this book before quite a few years ago, not really, but it's less recent in my head than it is for you. So I figure I'm gonna kind of turn it almost into an interview of you for this segment. So I don't have to rely on my patchy memory.
Sure, right.
But yeah, so what did you find? Because to preface it a little bit, I guess it's it's an autobiography. You know what I mean? As much as Malcolm X is an important political figure, from memory, it's not really a theoretically dense book or anything like that. But it's kind of just a personal story, and some of the anecdotes about his family being afflicted by white violence, in so many levels, his mother having been raped, and his losing his uncles and his dad, I don't know, it just makes you feel on a level that these other things can't, and then to see his own transformation. But yeah, I guess what did you get out of it?
Well, yeah, exactly. I wasn't really sure what to expect going in. I don't know. I think I did think I'd get some kind of. I wasn't expecting a political manual, but I was expecting something like that in a sense. But I did find it really interesting on the personal level. And, right from the very beginning, when he says his first ever memory is his, childhood home being burnt down by Klansmen and, just escaping in time. And throughout the entire beginning of the book, through Lansing, and I guess even after that, every small thing that happened, I find myself wondering, I wonder to what extent this affected the person he grew up to be. There's just so many countless things along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how he, he's so genuine in his being of kind of a working class, and I guess in a positive thing, it's sort of in a positive way that he's not quote unquote an intellectual, even though really he does make good arguments, and in those kind of TV segments he did and stuff. He's not part of the establishment sort of intelligentsia of we have these prescribed, he doesn't have a degree or anything. He just fucking grinded while he was in jail, which is just a great story in itself.
Yeah, and I think that, early on in the book he talks about how he wanted to be a lawyer, and his teacher told him, maybe a carpenter. Even though it's either the best or one of the best people at his school. It seems like he just naturally had very high intelligence, and then simply because of who he was born, he wasn't able to become what he wanted, which sort of led him to be the person that he became. And in prison, I think that's a good example. Most people don't make the kind of use of prison which they could. Not to say that it's necessarily their fault.
In a way, for all the injustices that were visited upon him, that's kind of one small place where the systemic conditions were kind of helpful. Just the fact that he had access to books, for everything else, for obviously the flaws in the prison system, and the fact that his sentence was kind of the harshest of the sentence was calculated, in accordance to the fact that he had supposedly corrupted these white women who were totally complicit. They didn't serve any jail time, right?
No, not at all.
There you go. You know what I mean? But I mean, just thank fuck he had those books, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's also interesting kind of redefining, because he's a very sort of powerful and aggressive figure. That's what I love about the book, is the way he writes. You get the sense he's not someone to be fucked with, and we were talking about this last time we talked about this book, where that guy in the jail who's kind of, I don't know if he's a debater per se, but he kind of has he's very intelligent, and he's kind of able to make arguments, and so it's this new understanding of how they even have power, because before there was kind of him in the ghetto, and kind of selling drugs, and violence is the means to access power and money and influence, whereas here it's that alternate value system, which is something I honestly pursue myself, to be honest, is like this power through, you know, debate and like and knowledge. Like if you get into
absolutely.
you know, debate with someone who's like, you know what I mean? It can kind of transcend that power hierarchy where, like, let's say you're talking to like, I don't know, Bill Gates or something, and you just like crush him with like facts and knowledge, or, you know, in Malcolm's own context, you know, talking to white people in the context of like television and just like basically destroying them with facts and logic, like, you know.
I actually found something quite interesting about the prison section. Even though he was in prison for 8 years, the chapter's very like quite short, I thought, and it's only one chapter. And you know, he goes through like briefly what he was like at the beginning of prison, and then a few other things, and then he basically just says, you know, I read a lot, and that's the end of the chapter. So for like, you know, he just says I read a lot for 7 years. You know, like that's insane. Like you fill in the blanks. It's, you know, not that he could have done a better job or anything. It's just the, like you have to fill in so much, you know, that I read a lot. It like goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
To like really understand how much he changed. And it's, you know, he's a completely different person after prison.
I wanted to pick up on one point, which was in terms of the racism. Like you acknowledge, like everyone would acknowledge, like he's an intelligent dude, and it's kind of this tension. I feel like within capitalism, where like there's ostensibly the idea of meritocracy, but racism is completely doesn't align with that, and yet racism in some way supports the system. So do you know what I mean? If you truly believed in a meritocracy, then you would be totally against racism from a kind of like almost like a libertarian perspective, and this would expand to things like the third world and refugees, which unfortunately actually does happen to an extent. You get this brain drain from people in Africa who you know, in some ways, sometimes they're already in a position of affluence, but essentially the most intelligent people are going to get, you know, they'll kind of be like labor exchange programs and kind of like, you know, studying overseas and that kind of thing. So, you know, for all the sort of injustices and inequalities faced by, in terms of like mineral extraction from places like the Congo with like coltan, you also have that brain drain of like, you know, the most intelligent people. But to get to the heart of that contradiction, you know what I mean? Racism is often fomented by political parties in order to kind of divide the working class. So there's a kind of way it's used very cynically, even though sort of theoretically it doesn't work. Like, you know, there's some people who make the argument that like you couldn't have capitalism without racism. I don't know if I necessarily, you know, I need to...
Racism can definitely be a powerful tool.
Yeah. And yeah, so all I'm saying is, you know, it doesn't really cohere with the idea of like meritocracy.
Yeah, well, absolutely makes sense. Well, I do think he's, you know...
Well, it's an interesting...
No.
Absolutely make your point. It's an interesting difference between kind of, you know, the sort of cultural elements of rightism and like conservatism versus like the sort of economic rightism, where it's kind of... There's still a sense of like discrimination in terms of like, oh, because if you're in a meritocracy... stop me if I'm ranting, but if you're in a meritocracy, you know, your position within the hierarchy is determined by your value, you know what I mean? So like people who think we're currently in a state of meritocracy would say that people who are poor, you know, simply aren't trying hard enough, which is a very ideological position.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say was, you know, right-wing people don't tend to say that they hate black people or poor people or anything, but they often, you know, fall over themselves when they say things like, you know, black people tend to just not work hard enough, which is why they don't get, you know, the same benefits as white people. Whereas, you know, they ignore all the factors leading to why they're in the situation that they're in.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do think, you know, it's quite interesting how he's just naturally intelligent, and I would say he's intelligent throughout the whole book, right? But there are some factors like how he gets quite easily aggressive, and I can't help but wonder, you know, there was that period before he was in prison where for years he says every single day he was doing drugs, and at the beginning, you know, it was just reefers, but at the end it sounds, from what he's saying, it sounds like he was doing cocaine every day, wasting so much money on these drugs. I can't help but wonder, you know, like to what extent is he brain damaged when it's drug use for years. and he talks about being in like a haze constantly every single day, and also how susceptible. I mean, there are a number of reasons why people become susceptible to religion, and I'm sure you could very well argue it's just because, of how downtrodden he was at the time, but I wonder if it made him especially susceptible to it. And I'm coming from the position of an atheist and sort of implying that more intelligent people don't fall for religion, which isn't necessarily true. But
well, he would be a perfect example of like disproving that thesis.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Yeah. But I do wonder. I mean, there's no question that he would have got some level of brain damage. But I kind of wonder, how is that visible, if it's even visible at all,
Yeah, I'll definitely go to that question, but I don't know. We might get sidetracked here, but I do think there's kind of a personality type issue here in terms of like, because let's say something like religion, even if we just pick Christianity as one example, I think that, or something like even going really deep, like existentialism, nihilism, and like antinatalism, they're kind of things that like are sort of, hesitate to use the word objective, but you read them and it's incredibly hard to deny that, like, for instance, life doesn't have any inherent meaning, but people, probably like tend to want to shy away from that. And I feel like this is like something that this sort of archetypes within our culture, like almost like Jungian archetypes of like, it's hilarious. I love the way this happens. This has been like transmuted into like the current generation, but like the ideas of like a boomer and like a doomer, like what are they but like kind of approaches to dealing with the world? Like, so there's a few interpretations of the boomer, and maybe it's better like, okay, because there's a perception of that we tend to have of boomers, or certainly that I have, and I think this links to religion, where it's kind of like a, you know what I mean? They aren't, we all have a fear of death and like realize that there's no inherent meaning to the world. And we kind of look at these people and we think, well, how can you be happy doing X, Y, and Z? Like you're, I don't know, spending too much time on Netflix, or they don't have a very fulfilling job, or like they care too much about money, but I almost think it's like, it's not stupidity, but it's like it's a personality type that wants to shy away from the truth, because the truth is in my opinion not neutral. Like when you read about like antinatalism and like delve into like you know what I mean, even to an extent veganism, I have
so much difficulty because I don't want to sound like my way is the right way, but I mean it's hard. Like I feel like things like veganism and antinatalism, well, especially like atheism, are just true. Right.
But I don't think the truth is neutral. Like the truth tends to, like in these cases, I think to an extent brings a lot of suffering. And I think some people can see that in the long term, the search for, that's certainly how I feel, the search for truth is far more important than these kind of false consolations, this kind of wish thinking. But it's not exclusive to religion, is I guess what I'm getting at. And there are other things that I think are worth mentioning, like I when we can get into it later, but in terms of like belief systems that are not religious in nature, but kind of equate to religion in the kind of like they provide a sort of quote unquote objective meaning for life. Some people might feel that way about like Marxism, and I bring it up in the context of this book because I do feel like unquestionably Malcolm X is like a black martyr, and I wonder what you thought about
that. But because he died defending black people.
But it's more than that. Like as a symbol, he really is this like, I guess it's like, because reading this book, I get something like, there's something really deep about it in the sense that he had this clear meaning to his life, and it's kind of imbued throughout the book, where like you read like through like the first couple pages and he's already saying like, I'm basically sure I'm going to die of violence, because of his inherent sense that there was some end goal to his life. Like I think the feeling that he was going to die of violence is very important. Like it's kind of a defining part of his personality. And so that feeling of there being a defined ending and certainty and almost as a result of that inherent meaning to his actions, that is exactly what religion provides, right? some people attach it to issues, and some people attach it to, you know, some kind of pursuit, be it philanthropy, you know, helping people, making music, and some people attach that to religion.
But I mean, it seems as if he had both, right?
Yeah. No, I guess I'm saying because he wasn't a Muslim all his life. Well, no, I guess you're right, because he wasn't necessarily an activist until after he was in jail, and that was only after. So it's the Islam which preceded his activism. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I guess the only reason I'm reacting so strongly is because the kind of thesis of like only, you know, smart people like see through religion or whatever. That's what I find problematic, and that's why I'm so worked up and kind of, you know, I don't know. I don't think my points have addressed that super well.
And you know, it's really tough, but I do kind of still believe that. But when he's in that extremely vulnerable position, you know, now he has nothing. He's still really young. You know, just coming out of this absolute drug haze. Then he's vulnerable, right? Then he can get captured by religion.
Yeah.
Although, I know, you know, you also kind of wonder, like, what else would he have done without the Nation of Islam? Like, would he have ever done anything for black people? Because that afforded him enormous amounts of power. In the same way Martin Luther King's position in the church afforded him heaps of power.
Interesting.
It's almost as if, and I'm not suggesting this at all, right? But it's almost as if, like, if he was an atheist,
that would be the best way of doing it.
The smartest decision would have been to pretend to be Islamic anyway, just simply for the power. I definitely don't believe.
No, but you're right. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah. And it's also quite interesting to me that, well, like, related to that is that he definitely would have come across the Nation of Islam even if he never went to prison, right? Because it was his family that got him into it.
Yep.
But, you know, all these questions of would he have still, for lack of a better phrase, fallen for it, and, you know, what he would have become without being the person that he was at the time when he got into the religion, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how, like, I mean, yeah, because you're right, but then, of course, like, they were the ones who killed him, you know what I mean? Like, you're still right. I'm not trying to use this point to undermine that, but it's more like, you know, one kind of wishes. I mean, this comes back to the martyrdom idea. Like, in a sense, I feel like he felt he had to die that way, and, like, it kind of fits historically. It kind of works perfectly. It kind of his story is not as effective, I think, if he doesn't die that way. I think that's what I find.
That's absolutely true.
Troubling, I guess.
That's probably. It's, you know, it's a large part, like these people being assassinated.
Yeah, that's right. I guess that's really what I mean in terms of the martyrdom. Yeah, people like MLK as well, and then even to, you know, not as political figures, but even someone like Kurt Cobain or Ian Curtis. It has the exact same. It feels like it wouldn't have been the same, and not to shit on their music, but it feels like it wouldn't have been the same if they hadn't killed themselves. Like, and it's very troubling, but it's true.
You know, Vincent Van Gogh's a perfect example too. You know. Plenty of people say his artwork is overrated, and it's just, you know, because of how he died that he's famous, which I don't think is true.
I mean, it's certainly not the case with X, but I'm saying it makes up a literally like integral part of his story, and really it vindicates him. It proves he was, like, you know, in a kind of obvious way, like. I mean, obviously he was killed by the Nation of Islam, not like, I mean, there might be even some conspiracy theories about the CIA being involved and stuff, because the event he was at, you know, they were screened for guns. Like, people were, you know, they were being checked at the door, so it's unclear how they were able to get the weapon in.
The event he was at when he was shot.
Was it the opposite?
Yeah, he chose not to be like Elijah Muhammad. He chose not to screen people. But, you know, I think there's, you know, a very real sense of Malcolm X being a martyr that's especially visual, you know, given the context of today with Black Lives Matter rioting in the US, And I remember seeing a post on Facebook where people are talking about, peaceful protests. And I mean, Malcolm X organizing peaceful protests never really comes up in the book, so I'm not really sure how true this was. But they say, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X organized peaceful protests, and they were killed. Specifically, they killed Brother Malcolm. So they don't work. This is why we need to riot. Which seems, kind of not true. It's like when they become a martyr, they also become some kind of malleable tool that people can just manipulate to fit their own personal beliefs.
That's a point I'd love to expand on, but I will just say, like I said, it vindicates him. If you're killed for doing activism, it's probably some indication that the activism has the potential for genuine change. The white establishment was terrified of Malcolm X for that exact reason. And while he wasn't, conclusively killed by white people, do you know what I mean? It's just, it seems clear that, especially towards, it's very intriguing, because towards the end of his life, he was making moves towards sort of making a coalition with kind of like some conciliatory approach to incorporating white people into the movement. And you see how
it was becoming less extreme.
Yeah, and the Black Panther Party, who would, are probably the biggest sort of concrete example of Malcolm X's influence, at one point moved to form something called the Rainbow Coalition, which was they were kind of combining with other sort of. So, do you know what the term lumpen proletariat means?
No.
So it's just kind of refers
to. Is it just everyone that's in the proletariat?
No, so it's people who are unemployed, engaged in like criminal behavior. It's almost like below the proletariat in a sense. So they're kind of having to find their own ways of generating income and living like beneath the line kind of thing. So these kind of groups, because Black Panthers would do stuff like, obviously there was the policing of the police, which is actually sort of resurfaced. There was like a couple of protesters carrying assault weapons who were labeling themselves like the new Black Panther Party, like in 2020, but I don't know heaps about that. But so obviously they would police the police and everything, but they would also have, programs to give like lunches to kids and stuff. But in terms of the Rainbow Coalition, there was a point at which these kind of, because the point is that these movements were very tied up in kind of like sort of like gang allegiances and kind of like, there was already kind of this violent subsection of society which could kind of be mobilized into this militant, movement for civil rights. And at a certain point they tried to sort of combine with kind of like Latino and white.
By the violent subsection, you mean like the hood? Right?
Yeah, absolutely. People already engaged in poverty who have more incentives to engage in like drug dealing and stuff, which we can talk about in terms of the historical context. But yeah, so Black Panther Party tried to form a coalition with these kind of like Latino gangs and white gangs, kind of working class people who, were also experiencing economic hardship. Because we touched on this yesterday over Messenger, the idea of like these figures being kind of canonized and then kind of being used for really anyone's political movement. You know what I mean? Like MLK, because and the thing of non-violence. I don't think, the point is not that non-violence is like morally superior. The point is it's like a pragmatic approach. I think an extremely effective approach given the right circumstances. If you look at like Gandhi, but it's not to say that it's the only approach. You just use whatever works.
Yeah, that's true. But are you saying that to like defend the rioting? Or?
No.
Okay. Right.
No, I think a lot of that's. I can't use the term as strong as indefensible, but I don't think it's helping. But I also don't think it's the place of people like me to kind of dictate the kind of praxis that these people should be engaging in. And in a sense, it's not praxis. Yeah. Like it's not, these people aren't like revolutionaries enacting some, stringent plan.
That's what I. That's what I find kind of
or attacking other black businesses and like it's awful. It's awful seeing frankly these business owners getting beaten in the street and like there was this one of this black guy who his whole quite an elderly gentleman whose whole story had been torched down and he felt like he'd lost everything. Like that's horrible.
I feel like a lot of the left wing posts I see about the riots are very diluted in the sense, that they're talking about like, but basically class war. Like the black people that are rioting aren't seeing themselves as proletariat, standing up to the bourgeois, that wants to reform the economic system. People seem to. I don't really know where they've gotten that idea from, but
I agree and disagree with you.
It's tough because at the same time, I can't really, expect anything better. Like there are these massive organizations like Black Lives Matter that, well, they don't really seem to be organizing peaceful protests. And when they aren't currently figures that I'm aware of that are at least as big and influential as Malcolm X or Martin Luther King to organize that. So of course, the mob kind of riots.
Is it? It's funny because like there's almost like I have like too much to say. It's almost like I can't. I don't know where to start. Look, yeah, I agree and disagree. Like the sort of left wing, and I mean genuine left wing. I don't mean fucking liberals. The sort of genuine left wing, like revolutionary left conception of class consciousness doesn't rely on. And I actually think this is a huge flaw, and I think we need to move past this because it's a very kind of old idea. But the idea is not necessarily that everyone kind of just reads enough books and engages with enough arguments, and then you just get a majority of the populace who are like you know what I mean, like they buy into the ideology kind of in a logical manner and they feel like they can make the argument for it. It's more that in the process of struggle, to give you an illustration, and this is kind of a fantasy in a way, but the process of like striking. So let's say there've been a couple of general strikes throughout history, and it's been a long time since the last one. I think there was one in France like somewhat recently, but in a general strike, not everyone is like a dedicated communist, like a comrade. But the point is, in the process, the idea is like people who are Marxists are not idealists. They don't believe that history, the driving force of history, are ideas. They believe it's the material conditions, and that ideas arise in relation to material conditions. Which makes a lot of sense in terms of ideas like racism, and we can kind of get into that. But the basic point about the strike is like, so general strike, like once you engage in a strike, you realize that like you essentially can't stop producing certain things. You can't stop producing food. You can't stop producing clothes. You can't stop producing whatever. So at a certain point, if both parties are at an impasse, the strikers have to start turning production for themselves. There were cases in like May 1968 in France where there was a factory that produced like walkie-talkies, so they would produce it for protesters so they could like, what I mean? They really started to like take control of the means of production. It doesn't mean these people were comrades, it's just a logical extension of what you have to do in that situation. So the idea is that through a process of struggle, they realize, and then especially the backlash, which is what's really significant about the situation right now, is you had one killing, and I understand there's a history of that, but it was a reaction to particularly to this one killing and sort of the environment that coronavirus has put people in economically. Obviously, there's a huge history of that. There's many more people who have died, absolutely. But then to have those protests and then to see that reaction to that, to see the cops protecting statues, to see which was later on in the timeline, but to see the violence enacted upon the protesters, that is what is the radicalizing force. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but so people's ideas, you see how in that context people's ideas are very much shaped through the struggle.
Well, yeah, it makes sense. But
is there anything I need to clarify?
No, it's just that when it comes to justifying the actions of the protest,
it doesn't justify it, but it's part of a process.
It explains why they're doing it.
Yeah. But here's the other really important point that has to be made. There's kind of a you can't infantilize people like this. That is also a kind of a form of racism. You know what I mean? Certainly, black people are more likely to be in the kind of circumstances that for really people of any race are more likely to result in them engaging in drug dealing, going to jail, engaging in violent crime, etc., etc., etc. But to take away their agency and say like, oh, it's purely the economic conditions, an individual can't really do shit. I mean, this is the contradiction at the heart of the Autobiography of Malcolm X, is he's talking about these kind of structural conditions, and even to some extent, in the introduction I was reading just before we started the podcast, he was talking to this white gentleman, and he was saying, so his perspective of the interviewer, and he was kind of saying how like at that point X was not really blaming individual whites. It was more, he was more turning onto a structural critique.
This systematic oppression.
And that all being said, like Malcolm X is a great example of like one's own autonomy and the genuine ability of people do have to like. This is not to be extrapolated at all. But like he did, in a sense, like whatever, fucking pull himself up by his bootstraps.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? It's extraordinary.
No,
like
I would also say that a large part of that was the Nation of Islam, and he seems to think that he was maybe not after they fell out, right? But he definitely seemed to be 100% thinking that Elijah Muhammad had just saved him, and I guess by extension that Allah had given Elijah Muhammad, the way out, who then seemed to free everybody else. It wasn't necessarily that he just like, because he was in, he talks about there was basically, he thinks almost no black person in America more downtrodden than him. And it's not as if he just like, had a moment of clarity and decided, I better do something with my life, It was that he was, somebody actually reached out to him. There was an institution, and there was like, I don't want to say power because he made them so much more powerful than they were, right? But there was some kind of power that actually reached out and got him out of there. I think, sorry, not to like switch the topic too much, but something like really interesting in the book was that that program the Nation of Islam had, where they got the black people in the ghettos off drugs, and they talk so much about, and like this book was written so long ago, and in society, the drug laws and the way we go about approaching drugs and drug addicts is like, so lost. But in the book they talk about getting people that were in that environment back there, meeting the drug addicts, and in this instance the thing they had motivating them to go off drugs was Islam. I still think it could be almost anything else, right? But the way that they got people off drugs, their specific method was really powerful, and there doesn't really seem to be anything like that today. In the context of atheism, religious people often talk about religious institutions that do so much good, and I'm sure today there are still probably Muslims that talk about how the Nation of Islam got so many people from the black ghettos off drugs, right? And there is no real big atheist organization that uses the methods that the Nation of Islam did to go give people some kind of meaning and get them off drugs and empower people, which we're kind of, as atheists, we're kind of doing ourselves a disservice. And until we really have organizations like that, we're almost proving the religious point of view. Like, look at all the good that religion does. And I think I'm not as well informed on Martin Luther King, but I think you could make a similar argument about people would point out all the good that the Christian organizations did.
But like you say, these are historical institutions of power. Like, I don't know if you've seen that debate between Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris, where Ben's making the point that, throughout, like, historically, all these great works of art and literature and architecture, especially. I mean, religious architecture.
Western society is
religious
based on
architecture is incredible.
Christian values.
Yeah, exactly. But it's, Sam just makes like a pretty basic but like great point that there just wasn't anyone else around to do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like just historically, so the same applies to the modern day. They still have shit tons of money.
I think what Richard Dawkins said on that topic was quite beautiful the way he phrased it. Like, we will never get to see what Michelangelo may have painted if he was commissioned to paint the ceiling of the Science Museum as opposed to the Sistine Chapel. But it just happened to be that the church was around to commission him.
But as an idea, I think it's actually quite powerful in terms of artistic production. Like, I mean, Dawkins in the Four Horsemen conversation does say that like when he listens to like the work of Bach, like he wouldn't have it any other way that this music is trying to kind of glorify God. At least as an idea, you sitting back and appreciating that as like, oh, this is the context that person was in. He wouldn't necessarily want it another way, and I would agree, frankly. And he seems to make an opposite point with Michelangelo, but I don't know that I'm convinced by that. I'm not saying it would be better,
Oh well, yeah, he's not necessarily saying it would be better. I think he's basically agreeing with Sam Harris.
Right, yeah, that's true. Because yeah, you take that individual and his talents and put him into any a different time and place, and like obviously it would be like a different building. Anyway, you know what I mean. Like he's still going to make some great work of art, regardless of which time. I mean, maybe that's maybe that's flawed, but yeah, yeah. So,
and it's quite, as opposed to work of art, revolutionaries or social activists like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, like Jesus, I'm sure people would argue.
In terms of what you're saying about the sort of community outreach programs and like drugs and stuff, like that's another really interesting, and I think it does tie into like too much of a. It's not that the structural critique is incorrect, but that we must engage with the individual and the collective at the same time. Like you say, obviously there is a cultural group in place, the Nation of Islam, to help these people out. But ultimately you have to help yourself out of a state of drug addiction, and even sometimes it's tempting to focus more on kind of the root causes, which is great in a kind of like ideal world where we have such a like a socialist utopia where we have enough degree. Do you see what I mean? Like
where you can actually address the root causes.
Yeah, or you can legislate away these problems. You can change mandatory minimums and 3-strike rules and et cetera, But you also need to engage with the individual, and you also need to like provide them with a degree of autonomy. You can't just say like, I mean, this is something that maybe you see this as like a bit of a perverse analogy, but like in depression, for instance, people are given a label and this diagnosis, and it's a
Well, I think depression and drug addiction are extremely similar, extremely linked.
But I think it almost applies to the psychology of black people in general.
Well, yeah, you can. I think you can definitely apply that to anyone downtrodden. And not to say that all, black people are depressed, and I don't want to make generalizations, right? But it's almost as if that entire demographic, or at least in the ghettos, was in something similar to a depression. When
you internalize those images that the society is kind of lasering in at you. Like for instance, that whole thing with black children preferring white dolls. They were given an option of black and white dolls, and even they preferred they wanted to be white, basically.
It's something interesting throughout the book where he talks about feeling ashamed at his past self for straightening his hair.
Yes, yeah.
And especially that, it was like quite a painful process to, straighten the hair using lye, which burnt the scalp. And he, felt so ashamed to be doing that to himself. And also the black men that would enjoy being with white women, and all the, the status and prestige that came with that, and how he felt so ashamed. I mean, that particular point with Laura, who was the black girl that he took out, and then ended up basically abandoning her for that white woman, and how he he felt so ashamed in the years after for doing that to her.
But yeah, so it shows the scope of the problem, right? It's so deeply ingrained in the psyche. It's not just these economic things. From those economic disadvantages, these kind of complexes arise.
It's a good argument for to show, like, internalized sexism, internalized homophobia, which a lot of especially where I've seen it, at least, especially more recent, feminists make the argument that even all women are sexist toward themselves and gay people, and in this case black people. So do you think, like, reading the book has changed how you would go about anything politically? Because that's what I was kind of hoping to get out of it.
Right.
And I'm not really sure that I did, aside from really understanding how big, like, coming from a powerful organization like the Nation of Islam, how monumental that was for Malcolm X.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately. I think it does tie in with my sort of underlying thesis of merging individual approaches to activism with kind of the collective. I think depression is a great example. I think depression should be a lot more politicized than it is, because people make, I think, quite convincing arguments that there are elements of neoliberalism that cause more people to feel depressed and alienated and isolated, and that's fine.
I feel like the argument that capitalism causes depression is extremely attractive to me personally.
Well, yes, yeah, I agree with that. You mustn't overinvest in that, especially, let's say take the position of an individual who is depressed. Once again, it's about promoting autonomy. So you should acknowledge those structural factors. You should also say, I do have to try my hardest. I do have to, just try really hard. But sure, that may be the case that our economic system causes it. But the point being that, like, yes, perhaps if we moved to a different economic system, or even had like a modest social democracy like the Scandinavian countries, there'd be less people depressed. But until that happens, like, there's probably comrades out there, there's people who are already engaged with those ideas who have a lot of depression, and maybe that's even part of the motivation. They need a sense of community, whatever. But there's probably people out there who are potential comrades who are too, beaten down by depression and by, especially, I think, alienation and cynicism and belief that, like, capitalism is the only possible system. So yeah, I think mental health needs to be politicized. We shouldn't view ourselves as individuals too much, in the sense of, like, so the idea of capitalist realism, which comes from the critical theorist Mark Fisher. So the idea that there's no alternative to capitalism, based on, like, or best represented by, I think, Margaret Thatcher pretty much said the same thing. There is no alternative. There's no such thing as society.
That pisses me off when you see, like, memes and shit. Communism's great in theory, but the good thing about capitalism is that, it's the only thing that works.
Right. It's an astonishing double standard. I mean, I don't want to get too far into this, but like, Marx is often accused, rightly, I think, by the left and the right, of determinism, stating basically that, like, socialism is inevitable once we, advance the means of production. It's going to, be in a series of ever repeating crises, and it's just going to fall apart. Determinism, but then that same determinism is applied to communism itself. Oh, it can never work. There's aspects of it, like, yes, historically, like, I despise the Soviet Union, and a lot of what it stood for, but that doesn't mean that inevitably that system goes to shit. You know what I mean? By that same logic, does capitalism inevitably have to start out with, extensive slavery? Like, you know what I mean? Just because it historically emerged in a particular way, like with religion, like that whole point we were making earlier.
It's quite interesting how, that line of thinking often gets applied to things that aren't necessarily even related to communism, like socialized healthcare or education, simply because it shares similarities with left-wing economic systems means it's, you know, it's awful. We should avoid it because, you know, we don't want to end up like the USSR.
And you know, it's hilarious because now what most people say is like, frankly, at least in, you know, Western democracies, the line is we don't want to be like the US.
Yeah.
That's what I hear from people all the time in Australia. Yeah.
Oh. Yeah.
You know, the country with some of the like the least regulation, you know, like in the world.
Yeah, but really all the time, something bad happens in Australia, it's like, oh, you know, at least we're not like the US. Even current day with the riots and the protests, people are like, oh, you know, at least we're not like the US.
Yeah.
And, you know, people kind of fight back against that, talking about how we treat Indigenous people, saying we are just like the US. Yeah.
I'm just very excited. It's this disavowal, which can actually be kind of problematic in some cases. Like that by condemning something, you know, external to you, you don't have to face the truth of that is internal to you. Like a great example would be racism. People see these white supremacists, they see like Charlottesville, and they think, oh, that's what racism is. That's you know, that extreme form, and I'm not like that. Therefore, I can't be racist. Well, no, it's a spectrum, and you're on that spectrum. You know, and I'm not. This isn't a thing of like, oh, everyone, I mean, like you say, to an extent, maybe everyone is, you know, racist because, you know, culture, structural factors, etc. But it's in this example, I'm sort of talking about someone who would be sort of middle of the road racist, who would kind of respond to ideas of like, you know, like black people not, you know, working hard enough or whatever. It's not that they would call them an N-word or lynch them or whatever.
Yeah, it's like, you know, they ignore the socioeconomic factors that, you know, made them predisposed to being the kind of person they are.
But the same is true of neoliberalism. People point to the US, and that just means it's okay here, we're fine. It's an excuse to not kind of, you know, deal with the struggles we have here. It's this precise, like Zizek talks about this. It's the, you know, one of the things that ideologies that's kind of endemic to capitalism is this overvaluing of belief. Oh, I believe a certain thing. Like it's this amazing contradiction where people will sort of believe like, for instance, you know, I do think this applies with meat eating. Like everyone knows it's wrong. You know what I mean? Like specifically factory farming.
Everyone will look
it's a
at
fucking abomination.
Or factory farms and say, I don't support that, and then go home and eat
steak. But something about that allows them to, or being against animal cruelty or something. It's something they can kind of give themselves and say like, oh, you know, I'm not a bad person. Like it's only because of that you can then engage in that activity. Or even something like, you know, we talk about like, I tend to overemphasize, I think, the sort of ideology of capitalism, like consumerism, for instance. I think a lot of people in our generation are actually very anti-consumerist. So I almost feel like I deploy a straw man when I'm talking about like, oh, the culture just tells you to consume. Like, I mean, yes, it does, but it's more of a thing in that older generation. I think that kind of propaganda and that mindset doesn't really work on us anymore.
Well, I feel like consumerism doesn't necessarily have to apply to, you know, like every week I go out and I buy 30 new outfits that I wear once.
Well, it's where does your value and sense of identity come from?
I think, you know, if you take like video games, right? That's like a really big part of our generation. And I think, you know, in the context of capitalism, if a big part of who you are is, you know, buying these games, buying the latest consoles, sitting at home and distracting yourself with video games, what are you doing? You're really consuming.
Yeah.
And it's no real different, as far as I can see, to going out and buying new clothes or new furniture.
No, this is the wonderful thing. We totally agree. I'm saying that disavowal of, oh, I'm not like that. That more extreme version of consumerism is precisely what allows us to participate in consumerism.
Yeah. I think I'm getting around to what you mean. Like, so, like simply, you know, because there is a Ku Klux Klan, right, that goes around lynching black people. There will be a lot of racists, and you know, I don't mean people that are intentionally racist, right? I mean people that don't want to address their racism or don't want to address the struggles that are, you know, black people face in America, and you know, they can point to, you know, really severe organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and say, you know, it's not like that. Or maybe a better example is, you know, they'll point to, you know, history and they'll say, oh, well, you know, like, what is there? Like, you know, black people can vote, you know, women can vote now, and, you know, and they get paid equal amounts. Like, you know, I just don't think racism and sexism is really a problem in, like not in today's society, you know.
I'd like to echo the point of...
And sorry, I
no,
just...
Please.
When showing somebody slaughterhouse footage, something you hear extremely often is, oh yeah, well, you know, this was filmed in China, wasn't it? You know, and organizations, you know, like Anonymous for the Voiceless actually show all Australian RSPCA approved slaughterhouse footage. So it's quite interesting. I just
the
feel
same
like
would
that's
apply to
somewhat
something like
related.
live export, where you'd have people who would denounce live export and, you know, probably, you know, go home and eat meat.
Yeah.
Although that is horrific, you know.
I feel like, you know, live export is kind of just, you know, I don't want to be against people doing good things because it's fashionable, right? But I think that, you know, a lot of the reason people are so against live export is really just because it's fashionable. And
well, I agree, but I also think it's that disavowal that gives them this sense of like, oh, I'm like a good person, I'm kind of excused for my other transgressions. Another great example I would point out, which is just straight from Zizek, is recycling. You know what I mean? You engage in like, oh, you separate the plastic from the paper or fucking whatever. And then because you feel like, oh, I've done my part, you then just fucking consume. You go out and buy like a huge TV, or, you know, you're running the aircon constantly, yada, yada, yada. So you actually... It'd be better in a way if you didn't recycle, because then you would have to confront all the things that you're doing that are significantly worse for the environment. But the sort of ideology of like, oh, you know, personal responsibility just is solely focused on recycling, which is great for capitalism.
I feel like I'm gonna take this so far away from Autobiography of Malcolm X.
I have a point I think is pretty important.
Go again.
So just not related to that, but you were talking about voting. And these kind of structural, you know, oppressions that have historically been the case and people don't see it as now. Well, there's this book called The New Jim Crow, which is talking about the private prison system in America. And just to very briefly echo these points, because I think they're so important, not being able to vote, being discriminated against in terms of housing, you know, being able to get loans, access to education, access to welfare. I mean, obviously...
even access to the voting system.
Voting, being able to vote.
Aware,
once you go to jail, you don't have access to any of that. I'm not saying even in jail, but being
also,
an ex-con.
Also, like people in black ghettos is a perfect example where they're working so much, and you know, this is like you know, a well-known fact amongst all of the working class people in America. A lot of them can't vote. They just don't get the opportunity to, even if they're not ex-cons or anything.
Voter disenfranchisement, yeah. But you know, the point being that like really like. It's just transmuted into another kind of system in the same way that, you know, almost immediately after, is it Reconstruction? I don't know American history super well, but post the Civil War, there were all these just sort of rounding up of blacks and arresting people for like vagrancy and these bullshit crimes so they can put them in jail and perpetuate the system in another form. I'm happy to leave that there.
Sure. So yeah, you know, I feel like this I'm kind of taking this to a very far away place, but I just want to say that, and I don't think I'm not inclined to say it's anything to do with left-wing people, but the, you know, that sense of, oh, I don't have to do anything, I don't have to take personal responsibility, it's all the system, we need systematic change, is such a huge problem with left-wing people, you know, and I see it all the time with veganism. I see it all the time when people say, oh, veganism won't do shit because 100 companies are responsible for so much pollution. Like, okay, what do you think is going to happen if we get rid of the worst polluting companies? Do you think you're still going to be able to consume the way that you are doing now? Like, I don't understand what's going through these people's heads, right?
Mm.
If we got rid of these companies, you wouldn't be able to consume in the way you do now. And, maybe not officially, but some of the most polluting companies are definitely companies that produce animal products, I don't get it at all. And a way that you can fight back against these companies, and yeah, right, I'm not opposed to, like destroying them through, putting laws through, systematically ensuring this sort of company that just recklessly, pumps animal feces into the ocean, can never exist. I think that's a really good idea, right? But if you want to fight back against it, one of the best things you can do is, vote with your dollar. And I understand a lot of people don't have a choice, right? Like, you have to work within the system, right? But, there's no need to be a consumer to the level that a lot of left-wing people are, and they just want to be in that comfy little zone where, like they're not doing shit to spark a revolution, right? Like they just don't want to take any kind of personal accountability. And I'm not saying that personal accountability is, the puzzle, but I think it's a very large piece of it. And I think it's all, fundamentally just not that related, right? Like there's straw man arguments against personal responsibility.
So I think it's exactly an example of the problem with taking away people's autonomy, and I'm not saying it's imposed on them. I think they personally relieve themselves of autonomy through this systemic critique. But I also think, in some sense, and I don't think this means it can't be overcome, but I think it's worth noting it is kind of, there's something about the human condition that tends towards that. We always want to believe that there is one obstacle towards, we see this on the personal level, where, once I get this car, once I get married, once I have children, then everything's going to be perfect and I'm going to be content with myself and I won't feel so miserable. And I think that absolutely applies to society as well. So to make a critique of right-wing movements, that this is what fascism does. If only it weren't for the Jews, if only it weren't for black people, dragging this country down. But the thing is, once you remove that, then you're even more like, imagine if they really did kill all the Jews in Nazi Germany, like it would go to shit. Like, they actually require that.
They require that goal to be moving.
It's totally pathological. Yeah.
That's probably what makes them so powerful and makes them so appealing, And something my high school history teacher told me about in the USSR was, not to compare it to Nazi Germany, right? But it's quite similar. They also have that goal moving forward. He says that people in that day really felt good, felt like the country was moving towards something, being fulfilled.
To make a very brief point, because I don't want to get too bogged down on this, but I feel like in the West, the biggest problems of capital, maybe not the biggest problems, probably this is just coming from my position of, someone who's relatively privileged. The effects, the negative.
It's tough because people that are quite privileged, like you and me, tend to be, the most tuned in to these, problems of, class disparity, etc.
To speak to your Soviet Union point, what is afflicting certainly the people I know, and to an extent it's exacerbated by Corona, but I think people feel this, like the issues of alienation, social isolation, as I already talked about, like depression, anxiety, like these are the real effects. I hope this doesn't come out very perverse in me saying like, these economic problems don't exist, and like, there are issues faced by sort of people who are in more precarious positions that are awful and much worse. But do you see what I mean? Like the economic conditions are not always the determinant of how happy and fulfilled people are. We're in some of the wealthiest society. Well, surely the wealthiest societies in history, and like people are miserable.
100% agree. Trump uses that line: "The stock market's at an all-time high."
What does that mean?
It's just garbage.
So I really want.
Although people like Ben Shapiro, and I'm really trying not to strawman him. I watch his videos sometimes and I try and understand him in the best, view possible. And I understand, American society is not his ideal society, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But he does often say things like, when it's not as if he would say it's not as if he prioritizes organizations over people. He would say, when private organizations are doing really well, the people will be doing really well, which I think is just, not true. I think these private organizations always have an incentive to exploit, the workers and the people.
It certainly can be true to some extent. I mean, this is the thing with capitalism. Like, for one thing, it produces many positive and creative technologies that do amazing things, like the internet. But it's how that technology is used. Something like automation, for instance, could either liberate people from work and lead to this great flourishing of people's free time and developing their own capacities, or it could just lead to mass unemployment. We could respond to that with a UBI, or we could. Do you see what I mean? Like. Even technology itself is not neutral.
Jobs,
Yes,
that's mentioned before.
Exactly. The society has to cover for the fact that it's this great thing of the technology really should be disruptive to the system. Like with intellectual property rights, the fact that we're in a post-scarcity already for digital media, but the system has to kind of cover for that.
Yeah, like in Japan, and I'm only using this example because it's visual, whereas 100% in America, Australia, other Western societies, so many people are stuck in bullshit jobs, right? But in Japan, something that was kind of striking to me was when you would enter a shopping mall, there's a lot of people that are paid to stand at the door and kind of smile and welcome you. And I just remember thinking what a strange job that is. Imagine that's your fucking job. That's what you're doing with your life.
It's kind of horrifying. Imagine you expand that times 10 or something. Yeah.
It's quite scary. Your job being pretending to work, basically.
I tried.
So something years ago that kind of that kind of had an impact on my views on communism and anarchism was thinking, right? Let's say I just took you and put you in the wild, right? It would take a lot of work for you to survive on your own, right? But you could imagine, right, if there's 10 people, the work of less than 10 people can provide for 10 people. And I think that scales, right? So in current society, when there's billions of people, right, we don't need billions of people at work, right? And billions of people are not at work. There's plenty of people that, are just selling drugs or working bullshit jobs, And so then there's kind of what are we going to do, with all these people that are kind of just sitting around, are they supposed to, get a job and not be bums,
I read a stat the other day, which was it's something like 1% of the US workforce is engaged in agriculture, and yet they produce the most milk, the most corn, the most beef of any country. 1%.
So automated.
Yeah.
And the majority of what they produce gets thrown out.
Capitalism.
Yeah, but I feel like it's tough because when talking about this, saying what you just said, capitalism, the glories of
that was
capitalism.
cheap. That was very cheap.
Yeah, it's so attractive, and it's so hard for me not to do. But, I could also imagine somebody arguing, you could do all of this with capitalism, if everything was done this way, it wouldn't be like this, and it would still be under capitalism.
The problem is incentives, right? People talk about,
if a doctor and a janitor are getting paid the same amount, what's the incentive for people to work hard under communism?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I agree, but I would say, I don't agree with that point, but I take your example, but I would also expand it more to kind of industry. when things are, for instance, the animal agriculture industry, there's no reason to engage in all this cruelty. Like, no one would choose to willingly just, you know what I mean? You have an efficient system and let's just add in some cruelty. This isn't like fucked up enough. No, insofar as it produces like cheap goods for people. If you reformed the agriculture industry, let's say you couldn't do it on a legislative level. Let's say you had a really, a benevolent capitalist who was like, oh, I'm going to give, better welfare standards for my animals.
Well, and that's what they really believe. They seem to really believe that you don't need legislation, like, in this instance, saying that, a layer hen must have this much space.
The problem is that means they don't understand capitalism, frankly, because, it comes down to the profit motive. Your incentives are to not, if you improve welfare standards, you're going to make less money. It means you can't squeeze as many pigs into a fucking little
that's
box.
That's why, despite trying to see the best in capitalists, that's why I still am like very much on the side of the left. Nothing's really going to deal with that issue that, people always want, the most bang for their buck.
And I would add to that a point made by a journalist called Ben Burgess, who I just encountered very recently, and was like, it's such a basic point that's kind of been with us for a long time, but the way he articulated it was just fantastic. Like, there's this cliche that like probably people of most political stripes would agree to, that like power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So that is why leftists advocate for like direct democracy. Like, most leftists are not statists calling for like the Soviet Union. They want to. The idea is, well, if power corrupts, let's disperse power to as many people as possible, so that it's in essence like what the American system is trying to do is checks and balances. Well, what if it's checks and balances between everyone?
I mean, that's like exactly the goal of unions, isn't it? Bring power back to the workers as opposed to the massive organization that controls them. Yeah,
I mean, yes. I wonder what a leftist would say. I just don't know. I'm not saying this is an argument in terms of people who aren't workers, like people who are unemployed or aren't part of a unionized industry, like things that couldn't even potentially be unionized, like if you're an artist who just works on your own art or something.
Sure.
But I don't know.
I guess maybe a good place to go would be like, if you'd recommend the book, like I would like for me, what I found like powerful about the book was, like you really get an understanding of, like who this person was and where he came from. It's quite hard to describe without, recounting his whole life story. But he, the specific examples he uses, and he talks about how he doesn't believe, any white man could truly respect a black man to the extent that he would respect a white man. Like from reading the book, I think you really do get a good understanding of why Malcolm X became the person that he became, which was interesting to me. Like, that's why I read it. I was like, well, didn't really know that much about him, but I knew that he was an incredibly important figure. Just wanted to know who this guy is, especially like our generation probably aren't that well informed on the accomplishments of him.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's an interesting question, like that it raises, because of the idea of like being sort of proud of your heritage, which is something that is very now like demonized in white people, right? But like I'm not necessarily commenting on that either way, but it seems clear that it is positive for black people to do that in terms of the history of jazz and like these activists and stuff, like you say, knowing their history. We talk a lot about like black history and having like an understanding of where they're coming from, and I don't really want to comment on like the corollary of that in white people, but clearly it can be kind of a positive thing, even though it's based on sort of a mistake in a sense, because like do you know what I mean? For one thing, race is a total construct, because there's more genetic diversity within Africa than there is between any races. So genetically, it's not anything. And also, in the same way that like, apologizing for your ancestors participating in slavery, you can neither take credit for nor be blamed for anything your ancestors did. And not only within your own bloodline, but also like your quote unquote people as a whole. It's tough.
It's interesting when he said like the best thing white people can do, right, if they really want to help, is go back into their white communities and engage with their other white engage with the white community, try and turn their community less racist.
I think it depends what you're looking for. One thing that struck me and was, I think shows great potential was I saw videos of people in protests. I don't know if it was specifically in Minneapolis, but watching the documentary 13th Amendment, which is about, I believe that amendment is the abolition of slavery, but it's about the private prison system and the drug war. So it's that, again, thing of like people engaging in kind of this like quote unquote mindless, destruction, whatever. Like it's through the struggle that they become class conscious. So I think education is so important. And to an extent, I might recommend obviously it is a non-fiction book, but I might recommend something that gets people more engaged with the politics of today. Like if you were just to read one book pertaining to race, I probably wouldn't recommend, Autobiography of Malcolm X.
Yeah, absolutely. True.
But yeah, I mean, if you're a person of color, I think it's an amazing source of inspiration. I mean, I think it's an amazing source of inspiration whoever you are, but as we acknowledge, there can be a positive way of taking on one's like cultural legacy and heritage, and I think that is an important thing for Black people, and they deserve that. So this is a great example of that.
Yeah, it was also just like a very entertaining book.
Yeah,
to
it's
read.
just a fantastic. He's just a good writer, and and a unique individual.
And right from the beginning, as I said, he talks about even his first memory being that terrifying, and it's really like that throughout the whole book. Really captures you.
Yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
All right, cool.